In today's world of commodities and mass-produced products, it can be difficult to find unique yet classic pieces that hold true value. Enter the vintage watch, a pre-owned work of art that has its own history and complements any outfit. Anyone looking to add a vintage watch to their collection is likely not only to be very happy with the purchase, but also to reap the rewards of a great investment. Let's start by defining a vintage watch. Serious watch enthusiasts don't always agree on exactly how old the timepiece has to be, but the general consensus is that a watch older than 25 years or so can be called vintage. Because of their many benefits, the interest in vintage watches is ever growing. Those wanting to buy a vintage watch, or even those simply browsing the physical or online watch displays, may have a good idea of what makes a watch vintage. But even the most serious buyers may not be aware of all the advantages that a vintage watch can hold. There's a reason that watch brands will periodically roll out a heritage collection of new watches with vintage designs. In terms of fashion, a vintage watch is an excellent investment. Not only will it stand out from the mass-produced generic watches that line department store shelves, but vintage watches also have a classic look that just can't be matched by the trends of today. Because vintage watches were created in a time when clothing was less casual and more elegant, their simple, classic style was designed to complement every outfit and elevate every look. Where many newer watches have a trendier, chunky look to them, vintage watches are generally slimmer on the wrist, which is both flattering and timeless. A vintage watch won't go out of style in a few years, so you won't have to worry about looking back at pictures of yourself and wondering why on earth you wore such a clunky, outdated piece. Because vintage watches are pre-owned, each comes with its own unique story. Many watch collectors and enthusiasts seek out specific vintage watches just for their history. But even if you don't know where a vintage watch has been, you can still admire its individual past by looking at its features. The patina of the leather wristband or a scratch on the watch face is completely unique to each vintage watch and gives it a character that today's mass-produced watches simply don't have. To vintage watch lovers, each scratch or dent isn't seen as an imperfection, but rather a piece of a puzzle that makes the watch both distinctive and beautiful. Additionally, vintage watches stand as a testament to the skill, knowledge, and determination of watchmakers from the past. Often, you can find a vintage watch from a now obsolete company, which makes for a beautiful, one-of-a-kind timepiece. Wearing watches nowadays isn't a necessity like it used to be, thanks to smartphones that can tell us the time wherever we go. But this doesn't mean purchasing a watch is unwise. On the contrary, a watch, especially a vintage watch, can be thought of less as a simple timepiece and more like a piece of jewelry that, when well taken care of, will only appreciate in value. If you're looking for a great financial investment, you can't go wrong with a fine vintage watch. They rise in price by about 5% every year, as more consumers realize their beauty and value. That's why you can rest assured that should you wish to sell your watch in the future, you'll make all your money back and more. Additionally, vintage watches may be cheaper than their brand new counterparts, so they're a great budget-friendly option. The limited supply of well-maintained vintage watches makes them worth their weight in gold. Just be aware that if you do plan to sell your watch in the future, you should know a lot about your specific watch to ensure it's not a fake or has altered parts, which can lower the value. One more thing to note about vintage watches from a financial view, because they're older and have been through more wear and tear, vintage watches do tend to need more upkeep than new watches. This isn't often a big deal to watch enthusiasts, however. The old-school nature of vintage watches means they were built with great care and attention to detail, so to many vintage watch owners, the extra maintenance is worth it for the higher quality. If you know a good shop that specializes in vintage watch repair for Omega, Rolex, Jaeger, etc., they can get familiar with their timepiece and know how to keep it in top shape. In the end, You are the only one who can decide whether a vintage watch would be worth it to you. To the vast majority of enthusiasts, the extra maintenance and learning curve are well worth all the advantages that a vintage watch holds. The idea of a truly unique yet classic piece of fashion that appreciates over time is irresistible to many. So, if you're willing to put in the extra effort to research and maintain your beautiful vintage watch, we think you'll be very happy with this investment.